The 14th of January 1971. A submerged steel cavern, 150 meters beneath the ice-strewn surface of the Barents Sea. This is the command center of the K-219, a Project 667 Ampere's Naviga-class ballistic missile submarine. To its crew, it is the pride of the Northern Fleet. To NATO, it is the Yankee class, a city killer, the Soviet Union's most potent weapon. Captain second rank Nikolai Azarov grips the steel rail of the periscope stand, though the scope itself is stowed. There is nothing to see but blackness. His world is not one of sight, but of sound, pressure, and time. His confidence is absolute. It is the confidence of doctrine, of training, and of the impenetrable fortress of the Arctic Ocean. His mission is simple: to remain a ghost. To glide silently to his designated patrol box in the mid-Atlantic, a square of ocean drawn on a secret map, and wait. From there, his 16 R-27 missiles could erase the eastern seaboard of the United States. The entire Soviet strategic deterrent rests on this principle: the bastion. The idea that deep beneath the waves, their submarines are invisible, untraceable, and therefore invincible. The air in the control room is thick with the smell of recycled oxygen, filtered diesel, and warm electronics. The only light comes from the faint green glow of instrument panels and the red-lit plotting table. The navigator, a young lieutenant, leans over his chart. He is painstakingly calculating their position. He relies on the SEVER radio navigation system, a web of massive transmitters broadcasting from Soviet shores. It works, after a fashion. But the farther they travel from the Kola Peninsula, the weaker the signal becomes, the cone of error widening from meters to kilometers. To truly know their location, to know it with the pinpoint accuracy required to launch a nuclear weapon, they have to perform a ritual. They must creep toward the surface, slowing to a crawl, and raise a complex antenna to listen for the faint, weak signals of the SEVER system. Or, riskier still, push a sextant through the waves to catch a glimpse of the stars. It is the 20th century, but they are still navigating like Magellan. It is a moment of profound vulnerability. Azarov gives the quiet order. The submarine ascends, its planes biting into the water, leveling off at periscope depth. The SEVER antenna breaks the surface. The radio room fills with static. The navigator begins his calculations. Minutes feel like hours. Every man on board holds his breath, listening for the telltale ping of an American sonar or the rhythmic thump-thump of a destroyer's propeller. Nothing. Silence. The navigator finalizes his fix. Azarov nods, and the K-219 begins its descent back into the silent dark. 3 hours later, the acoustics operator, a young man with headphones pressed tight to his ears, suddenly stiffens. His face pales. He doesn't hear a submarine. He doesn't hear a ship. He hears something else. The high-frequency whine of an active sonar from above. Not just a ping, but a rapid, searching series of pings that are mapping the ocean floor. It is the signature of a P-3 Orion, an American anti-submarine patrol aircraft. Azarov is confused. "Impossible," he mutters. "They are blind. We are 100 meters down. We made no noise." The sonar pings grow louder. They are systematic, searching. Then, they stop searching and focus. The sound changes to a relentless, sharp ping. Ping. Ping that echoes through the hull. It is the sound of discovery. The Orion is not searching, it is tracking. It is flying a perfect tight circle directly above their position. The navigator rechecks his chart. He looks at the position he calculated 3 hours ago. He looks at where the Orion is now. A cold dread settles in the room. The Americans were not here by chance. They were waiting for them. They knew this exact patch of ocean, this precise coordinate in the middle of nowhere, was where the K-219 would be. The impossible American element wasn't a lucky guess. It was a precise, calculated ambush. The Americans had a map the Soviets couldn't see. This single, terrifying encounter was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a reality shift so profound that the Soviet High Command would refuse to believe it for nearly a decade. If you enjoy learning how American ingenuity redefined the battlefield, subscribe to Cold War Impact and join our community. To understand the Soviet bafflement, one must first understand the Soviet mind. The Soviet Union was a land power. It thought in terms of territory, of buffers, of massive armies and impenetrable borders. The PVO, Their air defense force was a sacred entity, a shield built to protect the Rodina from airborne intruders. After the humiliation of the U-2 flights in the 1950s, they had doubled down, building a wall of missiles and radar so dense they believed nothing could get through. Their victory over Francis Gary Powers in 1960 had vindicated this belief. The sky was secure. They applied this same logic to the sea. The ocean was their ultimate buffer zone. Their submarine bastions in the Barents and the Sea of Okhotsk were just aquatic versions of their air defense network. Their confidence was built on a simple, shared reality. The ocean is vast, dark, and hard to navigate. They knew their submarines drifted. They knew their navigators struggled. They knew their inertial navigation systems were bulky, unreliable, and accumulated errors of several kilometers for every day at sea. They assumed, logically, that the Americans faced the same problems. They believed submarine warfare was a clumsy, near-sighted brawl, a game of chance and acoustics. They were catastrophically wrong. The American phantom that shattered Captain Azarov's reality was not a weapon. It was an idea. And like many revolutionary ideas, it was born from a moment of apparent defeat. The 4th of October 1957, the Soviet Union stuns the world by launching Sputnik 1. The endless, mocking beep-beep-beep of the first artificial satellite is heard around the globe. In Washington, it causes panic. In the Kremlin, it is a moment of supreme ideological triumph. But at the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, at Johns Hopkins University, two young physicists, William Geer and George Weifenbach, aren't panicking. They are listening. They rig up a small antenna and track the satellite's signal as it passes overhead. They are fascinated by the Doppler effect, the way the satellite's radio frequency appears to rise as it approaches and fall as it moves away. Out of sheer scientific curiosity, they begin a series of calculations. They realize that by analyzing the precise nature of this Doppler shift from their known location on the ground, they can accurately map Sputnik's unknown orbit. It's a brilliant piece of reverse engineering. A few weeks later, their boss, Frank McClure, pulls them aside. He has a question, a revolutionary question. "You've figured out the satellite's orbit from a known position on the ground," he says. "But can you do the reverse? If we know the satellite's orbit, can a receiver on the ground figure out its own location?" The answer was yes. The Phantom was born. This was not just an academic exercise. The United States Navy was facing its own profound navigational crisis. It was building the George Washington class, the first fleet of Polaris ballistic missile submarines. These SSBNs were the core of America's nuclear deterrent. But a submarine-launched missile is useless if you don't know where the submarine is. The Navy's requirement was brutal. They needed to know their position, anywhere on Earth, at any time, in any weather, with an accuracy that was previously unimaginable. The existing systems were failing, Lauren was too short range, celestial navigation required surfacing, which meant detection. Inertial navigation systems, INS, were promising, but they were mechanical. Gyroscopes and accelerometers, no matter how perfectly machined, would drift. After weeks submerged, the accumulated error could be miles. A missile landing miles away from its target, a hardened Soviet silo, or a command bunker, was a missile wasted. The APL's concept was the solution. It was codenamed Transit. It was, in effect, the world's first satellite navigation system. The idea was as elegant as it was revolutionary. America would launch a constellation of small, reliable satellites, each broadcasting a precise, time-stamped chirp and its own orbital data. A submarine, needing a fix, would not have to risk surfacing for the stars. It would simply raise a small, discrete antenna for a few minutes as a transit satellite passed overhead. By analyzing the Doppler shift of that chirp, the submarine's onboard computer, a marvel in itself, could calculate its position in all three dimensions. It wasn't just finding its latitude and longitude, it was finding its place in a global, space-based grid. The first successful transit satellite, Transit 1B, was launched in April 1960. By 1964, the system was operational for the Navy. By 1967, it was available to commercial shipping. The Soviets, meanwhile, were still building massive, power-hungry Seaver transmitters on their own coastline, convinced that brute force radio waves were the answer. The Americans had quietly changed the rules of the entire planet. While Soviet captains like Azarov were still fumbling with sextants and weak radio signals, their American counterparts were gliding silently through the deep, connected to an invisible grid of electrons from space. They knew exactly where they were, every minute of every day. This is why the P-3 Orion found the K-219. The Americans weren't just guessing, they knew the bastions. They knew the patrol routes. They knew the vulnerable moments when Soviet subs had to surface for a navigational fix. And with their own perfect, GPS-guided knowledge of the sea, they could simply park an anti-submarine squadron over a patch of water and wait. The Soviet fortress wasn't a fortress at all. It was a cage. The phantom in the sky was not the satellite. It was the grid itself. It was the terrifying, undeniable fact of American global pinpoint accuracy. The thump-thump-thump of the P-3 Orion's propellers was not a sound the crew of the K-219 could hear. They were too deep, but they felt it. They felt it as a vibration in the steel hull, a psychological pressure that was more terrifying than any depth charge. The relentless ping, ping, ping of the active sonar was the sound of a hammer striking their coffin. Captain Azarov's confidence, so absolute just hours before, had evaporated. It was replaced by the cold, metallic taste of fear. "Evasive maneuvers," he commanded, his voice tight. "Rig for silent running, full dive to test depth." The submarine angled sharply down, its hull groaning under the immense, building pressure of the Arctic water. The crew moved with frantic, disciplined energy. Non-essential systems were shut down. The reactor coolant pumps were shifted to their lowest, quietest setting. Every man held his breath, walking on the balls of his feet, terrified that the clank of a dropped wrench or the closing of a hatch would be the sound that betrayed them. The control room was a tomb of red light and whispered commands. The navigator frantically plotted their escape route. He was working blind, guessing their position based on the last known fix, now hours old. He was steering them toward the marginal ice zone, a chaotic underwater landscape of deep-hanging ice keels. It was their only hope to hide their acoustic signature amidst the natural chaos of the ice. But the pings followed them. They didn't waver. They didn't spread out to search. They remained locked on, a predator's heartbeat. The American Orion was not just above them, it was predicting them. As the K-219 turned south, the pings moved south. As they dove deeper, the pings intensified, compensating for the thermal layer. In the sonar room, the young operator was sweating, his headphones crushing his ears. He could hear the Orion deploying sonobuoys, dropping them in a perfect, damming circle around their position. First one, then another, then a third. It was a net being drawn in the middle of an ocean, based on a single, impossible coordinate. "They are talking to us, Comrade Captain," the operator whispered, his voice trembling. Azarov looked up, confused. "What?" "They are sending signals, not just sonar, low-frequency signals, coded." A chill ran down Azarov's spine. This wasn't a hunt, it was a demonstration. The Americans weren't just trying to sink them, they were showing them that they could. They were showing them that their most sacred bastion, the very heart of their nuclear deterrent, was as visible to them as a bomber on a radar screen. For 12 hours, the chase continued. The K-219 twisted, turned, dove and slowed, burning precious battery power, its air growing foul. And for 12 hours, the Orion stayed with them, a patient shepherd. Finally, its sonar signature faded. The Orion was low on fuel. It had to return to its base in Keflavik, Iceland. But as its engine noise receded, a new sound replaced it. The thump-thump of a surface ship, then another. The Americans had handed them off. A US Navy frigate and a destroyer had been waiting, vectored to the precise coordinates provided by the Orion's magical space-based navigation. The hunt was over. The K-219 was trapped. Azarov had only one choice. He ordered the submarine to surface. The collision was not one of steel, but of realities. As the K-219 broke the surface, its black hull shedding water like a surfacing whale, the crew was met with the harsh grey light of the Arctic day. And there, circling them at a disdainful distance, were the two American warships. Their decks were lit. Sailors, wrapped in parkas, stood at the rails, some holding cameras, others simply watching. This was the humiliation. There was no battle, no shots were fired, no depth charges were dropped. There was only the cold, silent, and contemptuous observation. The Americans had proven their point. They had tracked a nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine for half a day, forced it to the surface in international waters, and then simply photographed it. They had treated the pride of the Soviet Northern Fleet like a piece of drifting wreckage. Captain Azarov stood on his bridge, the freezing wind whipping his face. He watched as a helicopter lifted off from the American frigate, circled his submarine once, and then returned. The message was clear. "We see you. We know who you are. We know where you are. We can touch you anytime we want. Your bastion is a joke." The report he filed upon his return to Polyani was buried. It was deemed impossible by his superiors. It was explained away as an American tactical fluke, a lucky guess, or perhaps a new experimental sonar. The idea that the Americans had a global system that rendered their entire submarine doctrine obsolete was too terrifying to contemplate. Meanwhile, 5,000 miles away, in a secure building in Sunnyvale, California, the American perspective was one of quiet, revolutionary calm. This was the Air Force Satellite Control Facility, the nerve center for the transit system. There were no frantic chases here, no men sweating in red-lit rooms. There were just technicians in short-sleeved shirts monitoring racks of computers. Their pilots were not in cockpits, they were mathematicians and engineers. Their vantage point was not a cockpit canopy, but a global map dotted with the real-time orbital tracks of their satellites. The humiliation of the K-219 was, to them, just another data point. It was the successful application of a new reality they had invented. They saw the world not as a landscape of oceans and continents, but as a precise three-dimensional grid. And on this grid, they were the only ones who knew the coordinates. This was the true collision. It was the collision between two different centuries. The Soviets were still navigating by the stars. The Americans were navigating by the fundamental constants of the universe, the speed of light, and the precise, predictable laws of orbital mechanics. The psychological impact on the Soviet crews who experienced this was profound and corrosive. The ocean, their sanctuary, had been violated. It no longer felt deep and protective. It felt shallow and illuminated. Every creak of the hull, every unidentified noise, was now the sound of the Americans. They were phantoms, haunted by an enemy who was not even there. An enemy who could watch them from the vacuum of space. This wasn't just a technological gap, it was a psychological one. The Americans had achieved a new form of mastery over the planet itself. They had turned the globe into a digital battle space that only they could read. But the transit system was just the beginning. It was the proof of concept. It was precise, but it was slow. A submarine had to wait, sometimes for hours, for a satellite to pass overhead to get a single fix. The US military needed something more. They needed something instantaneous. They needed a system that could tell a soldier, a pilot, a tank, or a missile its exact location, anywhere on Earth, 24 hours a day, in real time. In 1973, at a meeting in the Pentagon over a long Labor Day weekend, a program was born. It consolidated several competing ideas into one grand, unified project. It was codenamed Navstar. The Soviet Union was still trying to figure out how the K-219 had been tracked. They were busy designing bigger, deeper diving, and quieter submarines. They were trying to solve the last war. The Americans, having already won it, were busy building the next one. The world knew this system by a different name, a name that would come to define the modern era. They called it the Global Positioning System, or GPS. The Soviets were baffled by transit. They would be utterly and completely defeated by what came next. The humiliation of the K-219 was not an ending. It was a quiet, chilling prologue to an era of total American dominance. A dominance built not on bombs, but on time. The Phantom was about to become a god. The Soviet High Command did what all entrenched bureaucracies do when faced with a paradigm-shifting threat. They dismissed it. The K-219 incident was filed away as an intelligence failure, perhaps a traitor on board. The reports of P-3 Orions appearing out of nowhere were attributed to new exotic sonars. They could not, or would not, accept the truth. They could not accept that the Americans had fundamentally solved the problem of location. Their refusal to believe allowed the Americans to build the system. The transit network was a breakthrough, but it was a 1960s solution. It was passive, slow, and required the user to wait for a satellite to pass. The US military, particularly after the ambiguous, map-era-riddled conflicts in Vietnam, demanded something absolute. They didn't want a fix every few hours. They wanted to know where everything was, all the time. In 1973, in a quiet Pentagon meeting room, the separate competing satellite navigation projects of the Navy, Timation, and the Air Force, Project 621B, were merged. A new, grand, unified vision was created, the Navsta Global Positioning System. This was not an upgrade. This was a reimagining of the planet. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity. It called for a constellation of 24 satellites orbiting 12,500 miles above the Earth in 6 different orbital planes. This precise architecture ensured that from any point on the globe, at any second of the day or night, at least 4 satellites would be visible in the sky. Each satellite would be nothing less than a flying atomic clock, broadcasting a signal of almost unimaginable temporal precision. While Soviet engineers were still struggling to build reliable gyroscopes for their inertial navigation systems, the Americans were weaponizing time. The first Block I Navstar satellite was launched in 1978, then another, and another. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, while the world was focused on the ground-based arms race on tanks in the Fulda Gap and SS-20 missiles, the Americans were quietly and systematically building an invisible infrastructure in the sky. They were constructing a global utility, a utility that would give them mastery over the physical world. The Soviet Union, finally waking to the threat, tried to respond. They initiated their own program, GLONASS, Global Navigation Satellite System. But it was a Soviet response in every sense. Reactive, underfunded, and plagued by the systemic flaws of their command economy. Their satellites failed more often. Their electronics were heavier and less reliable. Their atomic clocks, the very heart of the system, would drift. They were trying to copy a system they did not fully understand, while the Americans were already integrating it. The transformation was complete. The phantom of the K-219 incident was no longer a single terrifying ghost. It was now a permanent, all-seeing system. A grid of electrons and atomic time draped over the entire globe. And the world was about to see what that system meant in war. Case study. The first GPS war. The 17th of January 1991. Baghdad, Iraq. In a sandbagged command bunker, Soviet military advisors sit alongside their Iraqi counterparts. They are observing the opening salvos of Operation Desert Storm. They are not overly concerned. Saddam Hussein's army is the 4th largest in the world, a direct proxy of Soviet military doctrine, equipment, and training. Their T-72 tanks are formidable. Their layered air defenses, built on Soviet-made SA-2 and SA-6 missiles, are dense. Their strategy is a classic Soviet one: force the American-led coalition into a bloody, head-on armored confrontation on the Kuwaiti border, lure them into a meat grinder. The Soviet generals in Moscow watching the reports believe this. They believe in mass, in attrition, and in the fog of war. Their own doctrine is built on the assumption that the battlefield is a chaotic, confusing, and featureless place, especially the desert. In the operations room of the US 7 Corps, deep in Saudi Arabia, General Frederick Franks is looking at a different reality. His reality is a digital map. His problem is not if he can find the enemy, but the most efficient route to their annihilation. The coalition plan, the famous left hook, is something that simply does not exist in Soviet military textbooks. It calls for hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of armored vehicles to surge west, deep into the featureless, empty expanse of the Iraqi desert, and then hook north to slam into the flank of the Republican Guard. To the Soviet advisors, this is strategic suicide. An army that moves into that desert will be lost within hours. They will run out of fuel. They will lose unit cohesion. They will blunder into each other in the dark. It is impossible. They did not know about the SLGR, the small lightweight GPS receiver. Nicknamed the Slugger, this 5-pound battery-powered box was the first mass-produced handheld GPS unit. Just months before the war, thousands of them were rushed to the troops. The impossible happened. The left hook began. American and British armored columns charged into the desert at 30 miles per hour. They drove through pitch-black nights. They drove through blinding sandstorms that grounded aircraft and rendered human eyesight useless. And they never got lost. A tank commander in an M1 Abrams didn't need to look for a landmark. He just looked at a small, glowing screen that showed his exact coordinate. A supply convoy didn't guess at a rendezvous point. It drove to a specific 10-digit grid reference. Artillery batteries didn't need to walk their shells onto a target. They received a precise coordinate from a forward observer and fired a single, perfect round. The Iraqis and their Soviet advisors were looking east. They were staring into the sand-filled fog of war, expecting a frontal assault. They had no idea that their entire flank had ceased to exist. When the Seven Corps materialized from the impossible desert, the result was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Soviet-trained Republican Guard divisions, dug in and facing the wrong way, were hit from behind by an enemy that had navigated hundreds of miles of emptiness, as if it were a paved highway. The Iraqi T-72 seconds, their guns pointing uselessly south, were destroyed by the dozens, their crews baffled as to how the Americans had simply appeared from nowhere. The psychological shock in Moscow was seismic. Their entire military doctrine, built on maps, mass, and predictable fronts, was rendered obsolete in 100 hours. The Americans had used the invisible grid to make the fog of war disappear. The symbol, the haunting grid. This is the true symbol of American dominance. Not the satellite itself, but the grid it creates. It is the recurring, haunting element, the glowing blue dot on a digital map. To a Soviet general, a tank division was a physical thing. It was thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, a long column of trucks. It was noise and mud and diesel fumes. It had mass. To his American counterpart, that same tank division was now just a collection of icons on a screen. The J-Star's surveillance aircraft, itself navigated by GPS, could look deep behind enemy lines and plot the exact location of those tanks. Those locations were then passed, as digital coordinates, to F-15 E-Strike Eagles, who also used GPS to navigate. The pilots would drop a smart bomb, a paveway or a JDAM that had its own GPS receiver. The Soviet general's tank division was no longer a division. It was just a target file. It was a coordinate to be serviced. This was the ultimate psychological weapon. The grid turned warfare from a struggle of will and maneuver into a systems problem. The Americans had created a system where they could see, decide, and act with a speed and precision the Soviets could not even comprehend. The Soviet Union had spent 50 years building an empire based on controlling land. The Americans had rendered that entire concept obsolete by controlling the space above it. Every Soviet asset, from Captain Azarov's submarine in its bastion to the most secret ICBM silo hidden in the Siberian taiga, was now nothing more than a coordinate on an American map. A map they could not see, could not jam, and could not escape. The grid was everywhere. It was silent, invisible, and absolute. And it meant the Cold War was already over. They just didn't know it yet. The 100-hour annihilation of the Iraqi army in the Kuwaiti desert was more than a news report in Moscow. It was an autopsy. For the first time, the Soviet High Command, the Politburo, and the KGB could not deny the evidence. They watched satellite imagery and intelligence reports of their own T-72 tanks, dug into perfect doctrinal formations, being systematically destroyed from the air and from their undefended flanks. They saw American armored columns navigate hundreds of miles of featureless sand in a single night. This was not a fluke. This was not a lucky sonar operator in the Barents Sea. This was a system. The realization that settled over the Ministry of Defense was cold and absolute. Their entire military-industrial complex, built over 50 years, was a museum piece. The concept of the front line was dead. The fog of war had been lifted, but only for their enemy. The Americans had built an on-divided-by-off switch for modern warfare, and the Soviet Union was permanently in the dark. This was not just a threat, it was a verdict. It proved that the American mastery of information, of microelectronics, and of time itself was a weapon more powerful than any nuclear warhead. It was a weapon that made all of their conventional weapons obsolete. But the Soviet state was not designed to innovate, it was designed to react, and its reaction was the biggest, most desperate bet in its history. GLONASS. GLONASS, or the Globalnaya Navigacyonaya Sputnikovaya Sistema, had been on the books since 1976. It was the Soviet Union's direct, state-mandated answer to the American Navstar program. On paper, it was identical. A constellation of 24 satellites, a global grid, a promise of pinpoint accuracy for their own missiles, submarines, and tanks. The first launch of its prototype satellites, under the Cosmos designation, began in 1982. Throughout the 1980s, it was a program that moved at the grinding, inefficient pace of the Soviet command economy. It was a prestige project, a way to maintain the illusion of parity. After the shock of Desert Storm in 1991, that project became a desperate scramble. Billions of rubles that the crumbling state did not have were poured into the program. It was a panicked attempt to copy the American grid, to build their own on switch before the lights went out for good. It was a catastrophic failure. The failure of GLONASS was not a single event. It was a systemic rot, a perfect reflection of the dying empire that was building it. The truth, hidden in the technical manuals and launch manifests, was that the Soviet big bet was flawed from its very inception. First, there was the economic truth. The Soviet Union was bankrupt. The war in Afghanistan, the Chernobyl disaster, and the suffocating cost of the arms race had bled it dry. A system like GPS is not a build-it-and-forget-it project. It is a relentless, hideously expensive endeavor that requires a constant stream of launches to replace satellites as they fail. The Americans, with their dynamic, innovation-driven economy, could afford this. The Soviet Union, its economy collapsing, could not. The money simply ran out. Second, there was the technological truth. The command economy could not innovate. It could only imitate, and it did so poorly. The heart of any navigation satellite is its atomic clock and its electronics. They must be precise, miniaturized, and hardened to survive the brutal radiation of space. The American GPS Block II satellites, which began launching in 1989, were miracles of engineering. They were packed with radiation-hardened microchips, powered by robust solar arrays, and equipped with multiple cesium and rubidium atomic clocks. Their design life was 7.5 years. The Soviet GLONASS satellites, launched in the same period, were a different story. They were heavier, their electronics were more fragile, less shielded. Their onboard atomic clocks were less stable and more prone to drift. And most damning of all, their design life was, on average, just 3 years. Many of the early models failed after just one. This was the killer statistic. It wasn't a statistic of missiles fired or tanks destroyed. It was a statistic of time. For every single satellite the Americans launched, the Soviets would have to launch 2 or 3 just to stay in the same place. They were trying to win a marathon against an opponent who ran twice as fast and had 3 times the stamina. It was impossible. By the end of 1991, as the red hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, the American Navstar GPS was a robust, growing constellation, marching inexorably toward the 24 satellites needed for full, global, 24/7 coverage. The mighty GLONASS countermeasure was in ruins. It had never reached a full constellation. The system was fragmented, with only a handful of its short-lived satellites still functioning. The vast global grid that was meant to be their salvation was just a few broken, drifting transmitters broadcasting signals of failure into the void. The psychological toll of this failure was the final, breaking blow to the Soviet military psyche. For 40 years they had been defined by Sputnik. They were the leaders in space. It was their one true ideological victory. Now, they were reduced to a second-rate power, building a fragile, inferior copy of an American system they could no longer even afford to maintain. The realization was complete. The Americans not only owned the grid, the Soviets lacked the fundamental economic and technological power to even build their own. They were not just trapped in the dark, they were incapable of making their own light. This admission of total systemic inferiority was the true end of the Cold War. The failure of GLONASS was not just a technical failure, it was a philosophical one. It was the final, undeniable proof that the Soviet system, the grand communist experiment, had failed in its most fundamental promise. It had failed to build the future. The Cold War at its core was an ideological battle between 2 competing visions of modernity. The Soviet vision was one of centralized, state-mandated power. It was the command economy. It believed that the will of the state, applied with enough brute force and resources, could overcome any obstacle. It built the largest tanks, the biggest bombs, and the most numerous armies. The American vision, by contrast, was one of decentralized, networked innovation. It was messy, chaotic, and driven by competition. It believed in the power of the individual, the microchip, and the free flow of information. The global positioning system was the ultimate expression of this American vision. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a network. It was a system built on ideas that the Soviet command economy simply could not produce: hyper-accurate atomic clocks, radiation, hardened microelectronics, and complex, self-correcting software. The Soviets could imitate the physical object. They could launch a heavy satellite, but they could not replicate the invisible, intricate web of information and precision that made it work. GLONASS failed because it was a brute force solution to an information problem. It was a Soviet tank trying to compete in a microchip war. The American GPS, on the other hand, was the product of a system that had embraced the information age. It was a triumph of innovation over imitation. This technological gap was not just a gap. It was a chasm. It revealed that the Soviet Union was no longer a competing superpower. It was an industrial age empire, a relic, stumbling blindly in a new digital world that its adversary had not only invented, but now completely owned. The Soviet generals, with their paper maps and analog calculations, were baffled by GPS for the same reason their entire ideology was failing. They were trapped in the past, while America was already building the 21st century. The ultimate demonstration of this verdict was not a battle, it was a date on a calendar. The 25th of December, 1991. The Kremlin, Moscow. The grey, freezing dusk settles over Red Square. At 7:32 p.m., the red banner of the Soviet Union, the hammer and sickle that had defined an empire and terrified the world for 74 years, is lowered from the Kremlin's flagpole for the last time. It is a quiet, ignominious, and surreal moment. A small crowd of bewildered onlookers watches as the flag is unceremoniously furled. A few minutes later, the new tricolour flag of the Russian Federation is hoisted in its place. The Soviet Union, the impenetrable fortress, the bastion of global communism, has officially ceased to exist. It has not been defeated by tanks in the Fulda Gap or by a nuclear exchange. It has collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions, its economic rot, and its profound technological inferiority. At that exact same moment, 12,500 miles above the dying empire, the American-built Phantom is solidifying its grip on the globe. The Navstar GPS constellation is nearing its final, full operational capability. The grid is almost complete. The satellite, the invisible system, the very technology that had baffled their submarine captains and rendered their armies obsolete, is reaching its zenith at the precise instant its adversary is breathing its last. This is the Berlin Wall moment of the Invisible War. The fall of the wall in 1989 was the symbolic, political death. The lowering of the flag in 1991 was the official, legal death. But the completion of the GPS constellation was the systemic victory. It was the quiet, technical confirmation that one side had mastered the planet while the other had been relegated to history. The Soviet generals, now serving a new, diminished Russia, were left with the ruins of their GLONASS program and the terrifying knowledge that their entire, vast, nuclear-armed nation was now, and perhaps forever, just a set of coordinates on an American grid. Epilogue. The Cold War was not truly won with bombers or missiles, it was won with time. Mutually assured destruction had created a strategic stalemate, a world frozen in nuclear amber. The great power conflict could no longer be a hot war. It had to become a war of systems, a war of information, a war of precision. The Soviet Union, with its industrial might and mass philosophy, was perfectly suited for the wars of the past. It could build 10,000 tanks. But it could not build one microchip that could reliably challenge its American equivalent. It could build a satellite, but it could not build one that kept time with the mind-bending accuracy of an American atomic clock. The global positioning system was the decisive blow. It was a victory not of force, but of physics. America had weaponized the fundamental constants of the universe, the speed of light and the atomic resonance of cesium. Today, that system, born from the Cold War's most secret requirements, is now a global utility. It is an invisible, silent, and omnipresent layer of American-made reality that blankets the entire planet. The legacy is not just in the smart bombs or the stealth fighters, it is in the phone in your pocket. It is in the car that guides you home. It is in the global financial network that timestamps every transaction, the shipping containers that cross every ocean, and the emergency services that find the lost. Every time a citizen in modern Moscow, or Beijing, or anywhere on Earth, pulls up a map on their smartphone, they are doing something the most powerful Soviet general could never do. They are instantly finding their exact location on the globe. And they are doing it by connecting to a constellation of satellites, a global grid, built, paid for, and maintained by the United States military. The phantom that haunted Captain Azarov in the Barents Sea was not defeated. It simply won. And its victory is so total, so complete, that it is no longer seen as a weapon. It is seen as the air we breathe. A permanent, technological echo of a war that was won not with an explosion but with a ping.